At just 29 years old, Minamoto no Yoshitsune, the brilliant strategist who crushed the mighty Taira clan and brought glory to the Minamoto name, met a fate more cruel than any battlefield. Hunted by his own brother, forced into exile, and cornered by betrayal, Yoshitsune's tragic end reveals a timeless truth. In politics, even the greatest heroes can be cut down. The story of Minamoto no Yoshitsune begins in the shadow of war and bloodshed. He was born in the year 1159 during the Heiji Rebellion, a brief but brutal conflict between the powerful Minamoto and Taira clans that determined the balance of power in Japan. Yoshitsune's father, Minamoto no Yoshitomo, was one of the most prominent figures in this struggle. But fate would not allow the young boy to grow up under the guidance of a powerful parent. In the aftermath of the rebellion, Yoshitomo was killed, and the family's fortunes collapsed. Yoshitsune, still an infant, was left to drift in a world consumed by vengeance, betrayal, and shifting loyalties. The early years of Yoshitsune's life were defined by separation and loss. His mother, Tokiwa Gozen, became a tragic figure in her own right. She was forced to flee with her children, carrying them through the snow in an attempt to preserve their lives from the wrath of the Taira. This desperate image of survival would become one of the enduring symbols of Yoshitsune's childhood. A boy carried in the arms of a mother who had lost everything but refused to surrender. Eventually, Yoshitsune was separated from his mother as well, given over to monasteries and caretakers, cast into a lonely existence that was never meant to nurture him as a child, but only to keep him out of the dangerous currents of politics. These formative years left scars upon Yoshitsune's character. Growing up without the protection of his father or the stability of a powerful household, he was both vulnerable and forgotten. Yet within this vulnerability lay the seeds of his destiny. He would become a figure who carried both the pain of abandonment and the drive to carve out his own path, no matter the cost. It is said that even as a boy, he possessed a restless spirit, one that could not be confined by temple walls or the safety of obscurity. In the chaos of 12th century Japan, where clans rose and fell in cycles of fire and blood, Yoshitsune's childhood prepared him for the path of tragedy as much as for the path of greatness. What is most striking about Yoshitsune's earliest years is how little they promised of the man he would become. History is filled with children of defeated families who simply disappeared, lost to obscurity or absorbed into the victorious clans. By all accounts, Yoshitsune could easily have been one of them, a forgotten son of a broken house. Yet his story did not vanish. Instead, his very survival in the hostile aftermath of the Heiji Rebellion ensured that he would grow into a man who carried the weight of his lineage on his shoulders. From this crucible of war and exile emerged the fragile beginnings of a figure who would one day stand as both a hero and a victim of his own bloodline. In order to shield him from political danger, Yoshitsune was placed in the care of monks at Kurama Temple, nestled deep in the mountains north of Kyoto. This was a place intended for peace, a sanctuary where a child might be hidden away from the rivalries of the outside world. But for Yoshitsune, the temple was not a refuge in spirit, even if it was a refuge in body. The life of ritual and prayer did not quiet the turmoil that burned within him. He was the son of a warrior, and the call of blood could not be silenced by the chants of monks. Kurama Temple was no ordinary setting, however. It carried legends of Tengu, the mystical bird-like beings said to dwell in its forests and mountains, teaching those they favored the secrets of martial skill. Tales grew that Yoshitsune himself had been instructed by these supernatural beings, learning swordsmanship and tactics that would later make him unmatched on the battlefield. Whether myth or truth, the image of the young boy training in secret among the shadows of Kurama became part of the legend that surrounded his life. What is certain is that Yoshitsune did not remain a passive child of the temple. He pursued martial training, stealthily honing skills that would one day astonish even hardened warriors. During these years, Yoshitsune's character began to crystallize. He learned not only the art of the sword, but also the art of patience, the necessity of watching and waiting before striking. His time in the temple left him with a paradoxical nature. He absorbed discipline from the monks, yet rejected the idea of renouncing the world. Instead, he forged within himself a unique path, a blend of spiritual resilience and martial ambition. This was not the life that had been chosen for him, but it was the life he chose for himself. In many ways, Kurama did not strip him of his warrior identity, but instead preserved it until he was ready to act. Yoshitsune's restless heart could not be confined to the cloisters forever. The stories of the Minamoto clan's downfall and the continued dominance of the Taira reached even the remote temple. Each tale reminded him of his bloodline, of the father he had lost, and of the injustice that still hung over his family name. For a boy marked by tragedy, these stories were fuel. He grew determined to reclaim the honor of his clan, even if it meant stepping out from the safety of obscurity into the dangerous game of power and war. Thus, while Kurama Temple was meant to silence him, it instead forged him into the warrior who would one day step into history's stage. When Minamoto no Yoritomo, Yoshitsune's elder half-brother, raised the banner of rebellion against the Taira in 1180, the fragile balance of power in Japan began to shift once again. Yoshitsune, who had spent his formative years at Kurama Temple, recognized that the moment had come when he could step onto the stage of history. His heart had always burned with the desire to restore the glory of the Minamoto clan, and now destiny presented him with a chance. The journey from the isolated temple to Yoritomo's camp was not only a physical movement across the land, but also a symbolic passage from obscurity to recognition. For Yoshitsune, the decision to join his brother's cause was both natural and inevitable. He was bound by blood, but even more so by a sense of duty to avenge his father's death and the humiliation suffered by his clan. The Minamoto name, once tarnished and broken by the Taira's dominance, could rise again. And Yoshitsune wanted to be the blade that cut through the darkness. The meeting between Yoritomo and Yoshitsune was laden with tension, history, and unspoken expectations. Yoritomo, older and hardened by years of exile, had become a careful and calculating leader. He had endured the loss of family, the loneliness of banishment, and the constant threat of betrayal. Yoshitsune, in contrast, was younger, untested in large-scale battles, but brimming with confidence, energy, and a charisma that immediately drew men to his side. Their reunion was not just a private family moment. It was the convergence of two very different destinies under one banner. For a time, the brothers worked together with remarkable harmony. Yoritomo, as the leader, established the strategic framework and the political alliances necessary for rebellion. Yoshitsune, as the warrior, embodied the fiery spirit of battle, commanding troops with a skill that soon became legendary. Soldiers and retainers quickly recognized his brilliance. He was not only courageous, but also innovative, often thinking beyond traditional tactics and surprising his enemies with daring maneuvers. Yet even in these early moments of unity, seeds of discord were already present. Yoshitsune's natural charisma and battlefield brilliance contrasted sharply with Yoritomo's cautious, methodical leadership. To the men who followed them, Yoshitsune appeared as a hero of action, while Yoritomo often seemed distant and restrained. This subtle imbalance began to shape perceptions, and while Yoshitsune never sought to eclipse his brother, his very presence threatened to overshadow him. Still, during these first years of the uprising, Yoshitsune's relationship with Yoritomo provided the Minamoto clan with the strength it needed. The alliance of intellect and courage, of elder brother and younger, created a dynamic that terrified the Taira and inspired countless warriors to join their cause. For Yoshitsune, this period was filled with hope and triumph. For the first time in his life, he was no longer a boy in hiding or a monk restless in his cloister. He was a general, a leader of men, and a symbol of the Minamoto's resurgence. But beneath the banners and the victories, the fragile thread of brotherhood would soon be strained by ambition, mistrust, and the corrosive weight of power. What began as a reunion filled with promise would eventually spiral into betrayal, proving that family ties, even in the most glorious of times, could become the sharpest of blades. The wars of the Genpei period would offer Yoshitsune the stage upon which his genius could be displayed in full. Among the most celebrated of his victories was the Battle of Ichinotani in 1184. The Taira forces, confident in their position, had entrenched themselves in a stronghold protected by steep cliffs and the sea. Conventional strategies suggested a frontal assault would be suicidal. But Yoshitsune, unbound by conventional thought, devised a daring plan. Leading a small force through treacherous mountain paths, he descended upon the enemy from an unexpected direction, turning their fortress into a trap of their own making. The Taira lines collapsed in chaos, and Yoshitsune's name began to spread like fire. This was only the beginning. In 1185, Yoshitsune orchestrated another brilliant maneuver at the Battle of Yashima. The Taira, having retreated to an island stronghold, believed themselves safe upon the sea. But Yoshitsune's daring was unmatched. He led his forces in a surprise attack, using the cover of night and the deception of false fires to disorient the enemy. As the Taira attempted to flee, Yoshitsune pressed the assault, forcing them into panic and retreat. His mastery of psychological warfare and his willingness to risk bold tactics cemented his reputation as a commander of extraordinary vision. The pinnacle of Yoshitsune's career came at the Battle of Dan no Ura, one of the most decisive naval battles in Japanese history. Here, in 1185, the fate of the Taira clan was sealed. With a keen understanding of tides, winds, and the fragile morale of men, Yoshitsune directed the Minamoto fleet with precision. At a crucial moment, he capitalized on the betrayal of key Taira allies, turning the tide of battle irreversibly. The once mighty Taira were annihilated, their child emperor Antoku drowned in the sea, and their centuries of dominance ended in a single, catastrophic day. For the people of Japan, Yoshitsune's victories were more than mere military triumphs. They represented the overthrow of tyranny and the rise of a new order. He became a hero not only to his men, but also to the common people, who saw in him the embodiment of courage, brilliance, and honor. Songs and stories began to spread, celebrating his feats and painting him as the very image of the ideal warrior. Yet while glory surrounded him, the shadow of envy began to grow. Yoritomo, though grateful for the victories, could not help but view Yoshitsune's rising fame with suspicion. The court in Kyoto showered Yoshitsune with titles and honors, recognizing his genius, but in doing so they inadvertently drove a wedge between the brothers. Yoshitsune's triumphs, though brilliant, carried the seeds of his undoing. For now, however, the tale was one of victory. Yoshitsune stood at the height of his power, a warrior unmatched in his time. He had avenged his father, humbled his enemies, and carved his name into history. But as history has shown again and again, the brilliance that shines brightest often casts the darkest shadow. For Yoshitsune, the very brilliance that lifted him to glory would soon lead him down the path to tragedy. The triumphs that had elevated Yoshitsune to the pinnacle of fame also began to poison the delicate relationship with his brother Yoritomo. In the early years of the Genpei War, their alliance had seemed unbreakable. One brother provided the cautious political framework, the other supplied dazzling victories on the battlefield. Yet, with the destruction of the Taira, the balance shifted. The very success that had secured the Minamoto clan's supremacy now sowed the seeds of envy, fear, and mistrust. Yoshitsune was showered with recognition by the imperial court in Kyoto. The emperor and his courtiers praised him as the savior of the realm. Titles and ceremonial honors were bestowed upon him, gestures that reflected his unparalleled achievements. For the court, these acts were natural, for it was Yoshitsune who had led the armies that ended decades of Taira dominance. But for Yoritomo, who had built the political machinery of rebellion and envisioned himself as the rightful head of the Minamoto, such honors were intolerable. He interpreted them not as gestures of gratitude, but as attempts to divide the clan and elevate Yoshitsune above him. The difference in temperament between the brothers deepened the rift. Yoshitsune was charismatic, bold, and open-hearted. He inspired loyalty among his men, not merely by command, but by personal magnetism. Soldiers adored him because he shared their risks, fought at their side, and lived not as a distant commander, but as a comrade. Yoritomo, in contrast, was reserved and calculating. His leadership depended upon structure, discipline, and fear of reprisal. The contrast between the two styles made Yoshitsune appear more beloved, and this perception gnawed at Yoritomo's pride. Whispers began to circulate that Yoshitsune harbored ambitions beyond his station. Some accused him of plotting against Yoritomo, although there was little evidence that such schemes existed. In truth, Yoshitsune's devotion to his family and to the Minamoto cause remained steadfast. But perception often shapes reality, and in the tense aftermath of victory, every rumor took on the weight of truth. Yoritomo, increasingly consumed by suspicion, saw in Yoshitsune not a brother and ally, but a rival and potential usurper. The psychological dimension of this rivalry is striking. Yoshitsune, the younger brother, had always lived in the shadow of loss and exile. His victories had given him an identity, a place in history that no one could deny. Yoritomo, the elder, had endured hardship and built the political order with his own hands. He could not accept the idea that all the glory might be remembered under Yoshitsune's name, while his own role faded into the background. For Yoritomo, this was not merely about jealousy, it was about survival in the ruthless world of power. To him, allowing Yoshitsune's fame to grow unchecked was to risk losing control over the very clan he had fought to restore. Thus, the shadow of envy grew longer with every passing day. Letters between the court and Yoshitsune became sources of paranoia. Every gesture of respect toward the younger brother seemed an insult to the elder. The Minamoto clan, which had just risen from the ashes of defeat, now stood on the verge of tearing itself apart from within. Yoshitsune, unaware or unwilling to recognize the depth of his brother's mistrust, continued to act with loyalty. Yet loyalty alone could not shield him from the corrosive effects of suspicion. The tragedy of Yoshitsune was already unfolding, not on the battlefield where his genius shone, but in the private chambers of politics where shadows spoke louder than swords. the unraveling of Yoshitsune's fortunes came with brutal swiftness. At first, Yoritomo's displeasure was subtle, a gradual withdrawal of trust, a quiet exclusion from the circles of command. But soon, the distance became undeniable. Yoshitsune, once celebrated as the shining hero of the Minamoto clan, found himself stripped of authority. His military titles were revoked, his movements restricted, and the men who had fought loyally by his side were arrested or executed on accusations of treachery. Yoritomo's actions were not only fueled by envy, but also by a deliberate strategy. By isolating Yoshitsune, he sought to eliminate any threat to his supremacy. In the eyes of the shogun-to-be, there could be no rivals, not even within the family. Yoritomo began to frame Yoshitsune as a traitor in the public narrative, accusing him of disobedience and of collusion with enemies. Such accusations, once spoken, had the power to transform perception into fact, and Yoshitsune's reputation began to suffer. For Yoshitsune, the experience was devastating. He had given everything to the Minamoto cause, leading armies into peril, sacrificing comfort and safety, and achieving victories that had seemed impossible. To be rewarded with suspicion and betrayal was a wound deeper than any he had suffered on the battlefield. His sense of loyalty was not only rejected, but weaponized against him. The same brother whom he had sought to serve now treated him as an enemy. The psychological torment of this betrayal cannot be overstated. Yoshitsune was a warrior, accustomed to the clarity of battle, where enemies stood before you with drawn swords. But this was a different kind of war, one fought with whispers, decrees, and accusations. He was unprepared for the suffocating weight of political treachery, where truth mattered less than power and perception. Each day brought new restrictions, new betrayals, until the once brilliant general found himself reduced to a fugitive in his own land. His followers, once numerous, dwindled as fear of Yoritomo's wrath spread. To be associated with Yoshitsune was to court danger, and many who had once sung his praises now abandoned him. The court in Kyoto, sensing the winds of power, withdrew its support, leaving Yoshitsune isolated. The man who had commanded armies against the Taira now wandered from place to place, hunted not by enemies of the clan, but by the brother whose throne he had secured. In this fall from grace, the depth of Yoshitsune's tragedy became clear. He was not defeated by superior skill or overwhelming numbers, but by the corrosive nature of politics and the cruelty of suspicion. The very talents that had made him indispensable on the battlefield became irrelevant in a world where swords mattered less than schemes. Yoritomo's betrayal was not a sudden blow, but a slow strangulation, a gradual erasure of Yoshitsune's achievements and dignity. By the time Yoshitsune realized the full extent of his brother's resolve, it was too late. He had been transformed from a national hero into an outlaw, condemned to live on the margins of society. The betrayal was complete, and the road ahead offered no hope of reconciliation. For Yoshitsune, the path forward would be one of exile, flight, and ultimately, a tragic confrontation with fate. After the bitter betrayal by his brother, Minamoto no Yoshitsune entered a life of constant flight, a fugitive hunted not by strangers, but by the very blood that should have protected him. Cast out from the center of power, he turned toward the north of Japan, seeking refuge in distant provinces far from the reach of Yoritomo's government. It was there, among the snowy mountains and the remote castles of the north, that Yoshitsune attempted to build a fragile existence away from the relentless hostility of Kamakura. For a time, Yoshitsune found a sanctuary under the protection of Fujiwara no Hidehira. the powerful lord of the northern Fujiwara clan in Hiraizumi. Hidehira respected Yoshitsune's brilliance and extended his patronage, offering him safety and a semblance of dignity. In this brief period of respite, Yoshitsune lived with a mixture of gratitude and unease. He understood all too well that protection in times of political turmoil was never permanent. Even powerful lords could not afford to defy Yoritomo forever. Yoshitsune's presence in Hiraizumi was both a gift and a burden to his host. On one hand, he brought prestige and the aura of a tragic hero, a man admired by many throughout the land. On the other hand, he was a marked man, and sheltering him risked the wrath of Yoritomo. Hidehira's death would bring this precarious arrangement to an end. His successor, Fujiwara no Yasuhira, did not share the same loyalty or courage. Caught between fear of Yoritomo and the obligation of hospitality, Yasuhira made the fateful decision to betray Yoshitsune. The betrayal unfolded with cruel inevitability. News reached Yoshitsune that Yoritomo demanded his capture or death. Despite years of loyalty and service to the Minamoto cause, he was now cornered as a criminal. The brother who had once embraced him as an ally now sought nothing less than his total eradication. In Hiraizumi, Yoshitsune felt the tightening of the noose. He was no longer a general commanding armies, but a hunted man whose enemies closed in on every side. This phase of Yoshitsune's life reveals the loneliness of exile. He lived surrounded not by comrades, but by suspicion. Every whisper of betrayal, every glance of hesitation, reminded him that the net was drawing closer. Those who had once celebrated his victories now hesitated even to shelter him. The tragedy of his exile was not merely the loss of power, but the erosion of human trust. The unbearable awareness that no place could ever truly be safe. And yet, in this desperate state, Yoshitsune maintained his dignity. Accounts describe him as calm and resolute, refusing to surrender to despair. He trained, he planned, and he carried himself as a warrior, even though his battlefield was reduced to narrow halls and secret rooms. His life had become a paradox. A man of unmatched genius in war, now forced into hiding, his talents unused, his name transformed into a curse. The end of his flight would come in the year 1189, when Yasuhira finally betrayed him. Soldiers surrounded the residence at Koromogawa, where Yoshitsune lived in seclusion. The man who had once commanded thousands now stood alone with only a handful of loyal retainers and his family. The walls that had once protected him became his prison, and his long flight ended not in freedom but in encirclement. For Yoshitsune, the story of escape had reached its final chapter. The siege of Koromogawa in 1189 marked the tragic culmination of Yoshitsune's extraordinary yet ill-fated life. Surrounded by enemy soldiers and abandoned by political allies, Yoshitsune understood that his fate had been sealed. For a warrior raised in the traditions of honor and loyalty, there could be no more intolerable outcome than capture and humiliation at the hands of those who once called him kin. Thus, he resolved to meet death on his own terms, choosing to preserve his dignity even as the world turned against him. According to accounts, Yoshitsune performed the ritual of seppuku, ending his life in the manner of a true samurai. The act was not one of despair, but of defiance, a final statement that his enemies would never have the satisfaction of parading him as a captive. In his final hours, Yoshitsune displayed the same clarity and courage that had guided him through every battle. Even in defeat, he sought to maintain control over his destiny, leaving no room for Yoritomo to claim triumph over his body. The tragedy deepened with the presence of his family. Yoshitsune is said to have ensured that his wife and child would not fall into the hands of his enemies. In an act both horrifying and heartbreaking, he ended their lives before turning the blade upon himself. This gesture, though inconceivable to modern sensibilities, was rooted in the brutal logic of the age. To be captured meant dishonor, suffering, and degradation. By sparing them that fate, Yoshitsune believed he was preserving their dignity in death. When the soldiers broke into the residence, they found not a man broken by fear, but the still body of a warrior who had chosen his own end. Yoshitsune, who had once stood at the head of victorious armies, lay lifeless in the quiet of a remote hall, his journey complete at only 29 years of age. His enemies claimed victory, but the manner of his death transformed him into something far greater than a fallen general. He became a legend, an immortal figure whose story would resonate far beyond the politics of his time. The news of Yoshitsune's death spread quickly across Japan. For the common people, it was not merely the end of a man, but the end of an ideal. He had represented bravery, brilliance, and a purity of spirit that stood in contrast to the cold calculations of power. His downfall revealed the cruelty of politics, the way in which even the most gifted could be destroyed by suspicion and ambition. Yet it also elevated him into the realm of myth. In dying young, he escaped the compromises of age and preserved the image of eternal heroism. The image of Yoshitsune's final stand remains one of the most powerful in Japanese history. It embodies both the glory and the despair of a life caught between loyalty and betrayal, victory and tragedy. His story is not simply that of a warrior defeated, but of a man who refused to surrender his dignity even when every other aspect of his life had been stripped away. The tragedy of his death lies in its inevitability, yet the grandeur of it lies in his unyielding courage. Thus ended the life of Minamoto no Yoshitsune, a man whose victories shaped the fate of a nation, but whose downfall revealed the merciless nature of power. His death at Koromogawa was not the end of his story, but the beginning of his legend. For in dying by his own hand, Yoshitsune ensured that he would live forever in the memory of his people, not as a defeated fugitive, but as a tragic hero. The death of Minamoto no Yoshitsune did not bring closure to his story. Instead, it ignited the imagination of a nation that could not accept the sudden loss of a hero so young, so gifted, and so tragically betrayed. In the years and centuries that followed, Yoshitsune ceased to be remembered merely as a historical figure. He became a legend, his life retold in countless variations, his image transformed into that of a mythical hero who transcended the cruel boundaries of reality. Folk tales began to circulate that Yoshitsune had not truly perished at Koromogawa. Some claimed that he had escaped death by disguising himself, vanishing into the mountains where he lived on as a wandering monk. Others suggested that he fled across the sea, making his way to distant lands such as China or Mongolia, where he continued to fight battles under new names. In these stories, his spirit remained unconquered, too great to be extinguished by treachery. The refusal of the people to let him die in memory reflected both their grief and their admiration. The transformation of Yoshitsune into a cultural icon was aided by literature and drama. The epic tale Heike Monogatari, which chronicled the Genpei War, immortalized his deeds in a narrative that blended fact and poetry. Later, no plays and kabuki dramas further embellished his character, presenting him as the embodiment of tragic heroism, a man whose brilliance doomed him to an early end. In these performances, Yoshitsune was often depicted not only as a warrior, but as a figure of almost supernatural destiny, touched by the gods, yet crushed by human jealousy. Particularly compelling were the stories of his youth at Kurama Temple, where legends claimed he had been trained by the Tengu, mystical beings of the mountains. These tales elevated his martial genius into something otherworldly, suggesting that no ordinary human could have achieved the feats he had accomplished. By attributing his skill to divine or supernatural instruction, storytellers made Yoshitsune larger than life, a figure who straddled the line between man and myth. His loyal retainer, Benkei, also became part of this legendary narrative. The image of Benkei dying on his feet, holding a bridge against overwhelming enemies so that Yoshitsune could face his end with dignity, became one of the most enduring images in Japanese folklore. Together, Yoshitsune and Benkei formed a duo that represented loyalty, courage, and tragic sacrifice. Their bond resonated deeply with generations, symbolizing the ideals of honor and devotion even in the face of inevitable doom. The persistence of Yoshitsune's legend reveals something profound about the human need for stories that transcend the cruelty of politics. While history records that he was betrayed and driven to suicide, the legend insists that he escaped, endured, or lived on in spirit. This duality allows him to embody both the reality of tragedy and the fantasy of endurance. He is at once a victim of his brother's envy and a hero who could never be defeated. In Japanese cultural memory, Yoshitsune remains a symbol of youth, brilliance, and betrayal. His story is not one of simple defeat, but of transformation. By dying young and unjustly, he became timeless. By being betrayed by blood, he became unforgettable. His legend illustrates how a man can be destroyed by politics, but resurrected in the imagination of a people, achieving a form of immortality denied to those who live longer, quieter lives. The legacy of Minamoto no Yoshitsune endures far beyond the narrow confines of his 30 years of life. He remains one of the most celebrated figures in Japanese history, not because of the length of his service, but because of the brilliance and tragedy that defined it. His victories during the Genpei War reshaped the political landscape of Japan, ensuring the dominance of the Minamoto clan and paving the way for the establishment of the Kamakura shogunate. Yet his death exposed the merciless reality of power. Even heroes are disposable when they threaten authority. Yoshitsune's story has become a timeless cautionary tale. On the battlefield, he was unmatched, a master of strategy and daring who achieved victories that seemed impossible. But in the realm of politics, he was vulnerable, unguarded against the poison of suspicion and envy. His downfall reveals that in human affairs, brilliance is often less decisive than control over narrative and perception. The swords that won battles could not shield him from the pen and decree of his brother. At the same time, Yoshitsune embodies the noblest ideals of the warrior ethos. He fought with courage, lived with honor, and chose death over humiliation. In this sense, he became more than a man. He became a model of how to face betrayal and defeat with dignity. His seppuku at Koromogawa was not the end of his honor, but its final affirmation, an act that ensured he would be remembered as a hero, not as a captive. For the Japanese people, Yoshitsune's life continues to resonate because it reflects universal truths. Families can betray, power can corrupt, and greatness can be crushed by envy. Yet even in such cruelty, there is beauty in the way courage endures. His tale is not merely about loss, but about the enduring strength of human spirit, the refusal to let betrayal define the meaning of a life. In the centuries since his death, Yoshitsune has been remembered in songs, plays, novels, and even modern culture. His name is spoken with reverence not only as a historical figure, but as a legend, a reminder that the brightest flames often burn the shortest. he remains a symbol of the fragile line between victory and tragedy, loyalty and betrayal, honor and despair. The life and death of Minamoto no Yoshitsune teach a final lesson: that true immortality lies not in surviving, but in being remembered. Though cut down at 29, he continues to live in the hearts and imaginations of countless generations. His destiny was tragic, but his story endures as one of the most powerful in the history of Japan, proving that while politics can silence a man, it can never silence a legend.